Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about gardening, botanical history, and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is November 2nd. Today in botanical history, we celebrate the botanical name of the saguaro cactus. We also celebrate a Russian writer and mystic, and November Potpourri. We'll hear an excerpt from Tom Perrotta's best-selling 2011 book, and we grow that garden library today with a book that celebrates Islamic gardens. And then we'll wrap things up with some hip book recommendations, a very fun list from 1975. And I tell you, looking through that, it might as well have been written in 2021. Some things never change. Well, before we get to all of that, I thought I would share some November weather folklore with you because it is amusing, if nothing else. Here's one. If there's ice in November that will bear a duck, there'll be nothing after but sludge and muck. If trees show bud in November, the winter will last until May, so no budding trees. There's no better month in the year to cut wood than November. Ice in November brings mud in December. And then finally, a heavy snow in November will last until April. And then November's birth flower is the chrysanthemum. They're also the 13th wedding anniversary flower. So if you've got a 13th wedding anniversary this year, grab some chrysanthemums, maybe press a few, and then you can pass them on to your beloved. The green and blossoms of the chrysanthemums are edible, by the way, in case you did not know that. They are particularly popular in Japan, China, and Vietnam. Generally, chrysanthemums symbolize optimism and joy, but they have some unique cultural meanings around the world. Back in the Victorian era, the red chrysanthemum meant I love, while the yellow chrysanthemum meant slighted love. So you had to keep those straight. Now, in China, the chrysanthemum is a symbol of autumn and the flower of the ninth moon. During the Han Dynasty, the Chinese drank chrysanthemum wine. They believed that it made their lives longer and made them healthier. And as a result, the chrysanthemum was often worn to funerals. Now, if you're in Australia on Mother's Day, that's a day when white chrysanthemums are worn. The white chrysanthemums honor moms, and chrysanthemums are common Mother's Day presents in Australia. Now, if you're in Poland, chrysanthemums are the flower of choice to be placed on graves for All Saints' Day and also All Souls' Day. So a graveside flower. And then finally, in 1966, Mayor Richard Daley declared the chrysanthemum as the official flower for the city of Chicago. So Chicago enjoying their city's flower right now in November. The city is full of them. All right. Well, another item that I wanted to share with you here before the show is a poem by Charles Wright. Charles is an American poet, and he was also the 50th Poet Laureate of the United States. And he won a Pulitzer Prize back in 1998 for Black Zodiac. But today I wanted to share a little poem that he wrote, and it's called Autumn's Sidereal, November's a Ball and Chain. Great title. Here's what he wrote. After the leaves have fallen, the sky turns blue again. Blue as a new translation of Longinus on the sublime. We wink and work back from its edges. We walk around under its sequence of metaphors, looking immaculately up for the overlooked, or looking not so immaculately down for the same thing. If there's nothing going on, there's no reason to make it up. Back here, for instance, next to the cankered limbs of the plum trees, we take a load off, hard frost on the grass blades and wild onion, invisibly intricate, so clear. Pine needles and herringbone, dead lemon leaves, dead dirt. The metaphysical world is meaningless today. South wind, retelling its autobiography endlessly through the white pines, some such and susurration. Shh. Isn't that wonderful? Perfect poem for kicking off November here. All right, it's time for today's curated news. Well, today's curated news comes to us out of Athens, Georgia. This is actually a post from the University of Georgia. It's called Getting Happier with Horticulture, and it lists the healthy benefits of gardening. Now, what I loved about this article is that it highlights the trends that have been taking place in gardening since COVID-19 hit. And what's especially fascinating is that even though we saw a spike in gardening during the year most of us were locked down, 2020, that trend has continued. And so they have this fantastic little infographic. They call it the Plantdemic. And it just highlights a couple of the side effects of having a population in America of people who are spending more time gardening. There is a 4.6 increase in the amount of purchases being made for landscape items. And there is a 3.4% increase in plant buying. So that is significant. The United States alone reached over $15 billion in horticulture-related sales during 2020. And that entire sector was expected to increase almost 2% during 2021. So we'll wait and see if that actually happened. Now, there are a couple of other fascinating things that are mentioned in this article. One is the benefits of horticultural therapy and the health benefits of gardening. They are referencing an article, a study that was featured in Applied Psychology, and they found in randomized clinical trials that if you expose people to green spaces, to gardens, that is a great treatment for ADHD, because it turns out that green spaces improve focus. And so they are trying to incorporate more green spaces into schools where school children need to be able to have better focus. So that's pretty significant. Now, something else that gets featured in this article is a master gardener for the state of Georgia. Her name is Sherry Dorn, and she is especially interested in why people garden, and she wants people to garden more. She's a huge advocate for gardening. She says, that's the cool thing about plants. We can study specific age groups, whether you're in third grade, a sophomore in college, or a senior in a residential facility, and we can study all of those age groups, and we still see the positive impacts, the positive influences of plants, the relaxation, and the mental restoration. So just fantastic. In fact, another infographic that they share in this article that I'm going to actually print out and then put on my bulletin board here in the office simply says, happier with horticulture. I love that saying. That's fantastic. And the areas beneath it that they highlight for how do we get happier with horticulture are healthier diet, better concentration, and stress relief. So I think the big takeaway for me from this article is we've known all along that you can have a better diet, that the food is better for you if you can grow it and eat it. It's fresh and it tastes great. And there are tons of health benefits from that. And of course, as gardeners, we often talk about and even joke about the stress relief that we get from being in our gardens. But this whole concept of being in nature, working in gardens, being in green spaces, and having better ability to focus, better concentration, better recall, that's something new. That's something that's just starting to come out of new research on the human impact of gardening. So tuck that away as well, especially if you work with other people and gardens. So if you're working with student gardeners or you're doing horticultural therapy, that is a benefit that you should also mention. I think that's fantastic. So this great article, I will put a link to it in the Facebook group for the show. You'll be able to see it there. If you're not in the Facebook group, don't worry. You can always join the group. In fact, if you haven't joined the group because you're too busy or you don't spend that much time on Facebook, I totally understand. But maybe it's something you want to consider as you're coming indoors for winter and as part of your winter hibernation. You can stroll through the articles and the posts that you find in the group. And you can find the group very easily on Facebook just by searching for the words Daily Gardener Community. Everything that I talk about on the show, I usually end up putting in the Facebook group, and you can find it there. And I'd love to meet you in that group. So when you join, you'll notice that there are 3 little questions that I ask. There's a little spot for you to write. If you want to send me a quick little message or anything regarding the show, you can definitely take advantage of that. I'm the only person that reads all of those requests to join the group. So go ahead and send me a note, join the group, and we'll connect. All right. It's time for today's botanical history. Here's botanical history for November 2nd. It was on this day, November 2nd, back in 1902, that Nathaniel Britton, one of the founders of the New York Botanical Garden and a botanist in his own right, wrote to the industrialist and the philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. And he asked for permission to name a genus of giant cactus that was native to Arizona and northern Mexico in Andrew Carnegie's honor. Well, 3 days later, Mr. Carnegie's secretary responded with these words. Mr. Carnegie has yours of November 2nd, meaning your letter, and asks me to say that he is greatly honored by the proposal and will do his best to live up to it. And so the majestic saguaro cactus, the largest cactus in the United States, and a plant that is synonymous with the American West, became christened the Carnegia gigantea. Saguaro cactuses can live for over 2 centuries, and they are a living legacy for Andrew Carnegie. Now, the saguaro cactus is a little deceptive. The root system has one large taproot that is accompanied by very intricate and shallow roots that lie within the top 3 inches of the soil. Any precious drops of rain that hit that cactus are then guided down those mighty ridges beneath its arms. And after 35 years of life, saguaros produce a white night-blooming flower that is bat-pollinated, kind of like the night-blooming cereus. And by the way, saguaros begin to develop their arms after reaching the age of 50. So they have to hit some maturity milestones before they begin to flower or begin to get their signature look, those mighty arms that come out of those huge columns that the cactus is known for. Now, I found a fascinating fact about saguaro cactuses, and that the average saguaro cactus weighs 3 tons. So these are not plants that are easily transplanted, especially with that taproot. And by the way, it's illegal to dig up a saguaro cactus. You can sell them, that is legal, but you cannot move them. You can't go dig them out of the desert, and please don't do that. Now, the largest saguaro cactus ever recorded was called Granddaddy. I love that. I actually have a picture of Granddaddy in my office. Granddaddy stood 40 feet tall. He had over 52 limbs and was estimated to be 300 years old. So, wonderful old cactus, Granddaddy. All right, and today is also the birth of Daniil Andreyev. He was the Russian writer and poet and mystic, and he was born on this day, November 2nd, in 1906. Daniil wrote a book called The Rose of the World, and he wrote it during an 8.5-year period that he spent as a prisoner in a Stalin prison camp. Daniil once wrote, "Perhaps the worst will never come to pass, and tyranny on such a scale will never recur. Perhaps humanity will forevermore retain the memory of Russia's terrible historical experience. Every heart nurses that hope, and without it, life would be unbearable." Well, Daniil had uncanny powers of recall and memory, and he was also a voracious reader, and he grew his personal library to over 2,000 books by the time he was arrested and then incarcerated back in 1947. Daniil suffered from a spinal defect, and he wore an iron corset during his time in prison to cope with the pain. Daniil began having mystic experiences as an adolescent, and his first poem, by the way, was called The Garden. But in 1949, at the Vladimir High Security Prison, Daniil started to have regular spiritual encounters and visions. And so he used those experiences to write The Rose of the World at night. He had his final transcendent revelation in November of 1953, and then he finished the book after he was released from prison in 1957. And then Daniil kept the book to himself. He hid it from the government in order to keep it from being destroyed. That was a fate that happened to much of his earlier work. Well, Daniil's Rose of the World remained hidden before finally getting published in 1991 under Gorbachev. The Rose of the World was an instant bestseller in Russia as well, and Daniel H. Shubin wrote the latest English translation of this book in 2018. Shubin wrote that Daniil envisioned the reign of the Rose of the World on Earth in the 23rd century, the future epoch being a golden age of humanity, whose essence will develop into a close connection between God and people. It includes a society that consists of a worldwide ecclesiastical fraternity. Now, Daniil himself explained the Rose of the World this way. Rose of the World can be compared to an inverted flower whose root is in heaven, where the petal bowl is here among humanity on earth. Its stem is the revelation through which the spiritual sap flows, sustaining and strengthening its petals. But other than the petals, it also has a pith, and this is its individual teaching. So there you go, The Rose of the World from Daniil Andreyev. And finally, it was on this day, November 2nd, in 1954, that the Journal Herald out of Dayton, Ohio, ran a little snippet on the wonder of Potpourri from the November Garden. And I was on Facebook the other day, and I noticed that listener Rebecca Stoner Kurtz was putting together a little potpourri workshop in her garden. She's a garden writer, and she does lots of fun little things with gardeners in her area. So I was thinking about Rebecca as I was reading this little post about potpourri from 1954. Anyway, here's what it said. The November garden has her odors. In most instances, they are not so beguiling as those of spring and summer, yet they are far from displeasing. There is the sharp, vinegary tang that arises from its leaves, sodden and cold. There is the odor of soil on which frost has laid whiteness, an odor which seems different from that of earth newly turned in spring. There is the pungence that rises from rotting apples and pears, and the heavy fragrance which issues from the chrysanthemum, leaf and blossom. Occasionally, a flower remains whose breath is that of July, even though the hand of chill has pressed heavily on the garden. The sweet alyssum has summer perfume, and a rose spared has a scent which speaks nostalgically of June. But in the main, the odor of the November garden is distinctive, sharp, penetrating, and has something of that element of age, which cannot be associated with redolence, but rather with a potpourri. It's time for today's unearthed words. Today's unearthed words come to us from Tom Perrotta. This is an excerpt from his book called The Leftovers. This was a New York Times notable book for 2011. It was also a notable book for the Washington Post. It was on the USA Today's 10 books we loved reading in 2011. And it was one of NPR's 10 best novels for that year. Now, the plot of this book goes like this. What if, whoosh, right now, with no explanation, a number of us simply vanished? Would some of us collapse? Would others of us go on one foot in front of the other, as we did before the world turned upside down? Kind of reminds me of the Avengers, by the way. Well, that's what bewildered citizens of Mapleton, the setting for this book, who lost many of their neighbors, friends, and lovers in the event that became known as the sudden departure. And that's what they have to figure out, because nothing has been the same since it happened. And so here's today's excerpt from The Leftovers. She felt strong and blissfully empty, gliding through the crisp November air, enjoying the intermittent warmth of the sun as it filtered down through the overhanging trees, which were mostly stripped of their foliage. It was that trashy, post-Halloween part of the fall, yellow and orange leaves littering the ground. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Art of the Islamic Garden by Emma Clark. This book came out in 2011, so an oldie but goodie. It's already 10 years old. And here's what Emma wrote in the beginning of this book. Even a glimmer of understanding of traditional Islamic art and architecture clearly reveals that its beauty is not simply surface decoration, but is a reflection of a deep knowledge and understanding of the natural order and of the divine unity that penetrates all of our lives. studying Islamic art and architecture and completing a master's thesis on Islamic gardens and garden carpet at the Royal College of Art opened my eyes to the meaning of art. Understanding something of the religion of Islam in general and Islamic art in particular, it became clear that all art, to a greater or lesser degree, should be a vehicle of hope. It should remind us what it means to be human, of our place in the universe, and our role, as is said in Islam, as God's vice regent on earth. And then she writes, and bear in mind this is 2011, in the increasingly difficult times in which we live, it is good to be reminded that gardens and nature transcend nationality, race, religion, color, and ideology. The Islamic garden is not only for Muslims, its beauty is apparent to everyone. In her book, Emma offers an introduction to the design, the symbolism, and the planting of the traditional Islamic garden. And she also gives some practical tips if you're interested in creating an Islamic garden for yourself. Now, Emma points out that we all have different starting points for our gardens. We have different sizes and situations. You might be in an urban garden or a country garden, obviously different climates and soils and so on. And so she spends a couple of chapters offering up ideas for plants and trees and shrubs that you might want to consider incorporating into an Islamic-inspired garden. Now, there is a pattern to Islamic gardens. They're often constructed around a central pool or fountain with 4 streams that are flowing symbolically to the 4 corners of the earth. Now, my favorite part of this book is exploring the symbolism behind what we're seeing in Islamic art and gardens. I find that absolutely fascinating. And by the way, there is a magnificent chapter in this book that is all about the Prince of Wales carpet garden. It's just spectacular. Now, this book is out of print, and I predict that copies of this book are only going to get harder to get as time goes on. So if you have any interest, you should make sure that this one gets on your list. As always, you can get a copy of The Art of the Islamic Garden by Emma Clark and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $26. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. It was on this day, November 2nd, in 1975, that the New York Times ran their Around the Garden segment, and they recommended some new garden books. And I couldn't help but chuckle a little bit as I was going through this list, because honestly, there were moments when I thought, that this list could be appropriate for us right now, almost 5 decades later. So I wanted to share this with you. And by the way, you might be inspired to find some of these old gems for yourself. But I will also put a list of these books in Friday's newsletter. So you'll also have a handy little list there with links to where you can buy some of these very old books. All right, so without further ado, let's go through this. And by the way, I just want to mention that the commentary that was written about in this article by the editor is just priceless too. I absolutely love it. So here we go. We kick things off. It says, some bright newcomers have been added to the trowel watering can library. Here they are. Masakuni Kawasumi spent 3 years in this country adapting his Japanese methods of bonsai growing to American species of trees. His book, Bonsai with American Trees, is the result. And it's an excellent basic primer. Then the next book that they recommend, that they describe, starts out this way: tapeworm plant, living stones, bead vine, spider web, and polka dot are a few of the offbeat plants described in the book Fun with Growing Odd and Curious Houseplants by Virginie and George Albert. This odd-sized book, 6.5 by 11 inches, gives brief biographies and how-to-grow tips for many unusual houseplants and delightful changes from the tried and true. And while we're on the subject of fun, here's Jack Kramer's How to Identify and Care for Houseplants. And then they say that the fun comes in matching the line drawings and silhouettes to the author's organizational key. Though probably not meant to be a puzzle book, it is. A plant number 813 turns out to be none other than the Cattleya orchid. So that book sounds very complicated. I wouldn't recommend that one. But then next up, we have this one. Thalassa Crusoe, television lady of the trowel, has done it again. This time she's telling about making vegetables grow. That's the name of her book. It's one of her best, with chatty, helpful tips on bringing the crop in abundantly. Light gardens are booming, especially among those who have dark apartments and want some greenery indoors. And the book, The Complete Book of Houseplants Under Lights by Charles Martin Fitch, updates the hobby and is full of ideas. And then joining the series of state books on wildflowers by John E. Klimas Jr. is a book called A Pocket Guide to the Common Wildflowers of New York. This book sold for $5.95 back in 1975. Descriptions are in everyday language and not botanist twang. That's the last thing we want. All right. And then let's see here. There is Wild and Garden Roses by Gordon Edwards. Environmental awareness has come full circle with the book Organic Flower Gardening by Catherine Osgood Foster. This book was $13 back in 1975, and organic flower gardening was a relatively new topic. And so they ask this question: an organic gardener's book on raising flowers? Mrs. Foster explains why. And so here's what she said, and this was breaking news back then. One is for the sake of the bees, wasps, and other beneficial insects and butterflies. Another good reason is to protect the birds. And the most important reason is that you avoid starting chain reactions in the environment from poisonous chemical sprays and dusts that you might introduce. And then finally, they say this. Here is Winter Reading by the Fireplace. The first one is A Gardener Touched with Genius. It's a biography of the life of Luther Burbank. Great book, by the way. This was by Peter Dreyer, and it was $10 when it came out. Then second on this list is The Best of American Gardening by Ken and Pat Graft. And this little book is a gem. It has garden tips that were gleaned from 100-year-old seed catalogs. What a great idea. So by Ken and Pat Graft, that one is called The Best of American Gardening. And then B.J. Healy's fantastic book, The Plant Hunters, made this list. B.J.'s book offers brief biographies of the folks who went out and discovered plants from the 17th century to the present, up until 1975. And then finally, 3 to go here, last 3. Ornamental Grasses by Mary Hockenberry. I love what they wrote here. They said, it's an excellent, well-illustrated guide to this unusual group of plants. Not much ornamental grass planting, apparently, back in 1975. Then Bernard Wolgenzinger and Jose Didone wrote a book called The Personal Garden. It's architecture and design. This was a $30 book back in 1975. It was beautifully illustrated with design concepts from Europe, Western, and Japanese gardens. And then finally, a book called Plant a Tree by Michael Weiner. This was a working guide to regreening America. They wrote that it was a good reference book about tree planting and care. And then there was this little aside about avocados. They wrote, Florida, Texas, and California, where the avocado tree is grown commercially, the trees do not start flowering until 6 years old or sooner if grafted. Now, one rare exception was reported by Barbara Stempson, who was a gardener in Maine, and she wrote that her indoor avocado did flower, but no fruit, when it was about 2 years old and 4 feet high. So there you go. A nice little list of garden books from 1975. And don't forget that I will have that list in the Friday newsletter. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove and Wyoming, Minnesota. If you want to read today's show notes, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. And don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can always get in touch by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.